Who created God? The biblical answer atheists don't want you to hear. If God created everything, then who created God? This is one of the most common questions thrown at Christians, especially by atheists and skeptics. On the surface, it sounds like a solid argument against the existence of God. After all, if we claim that everything has a cause, then doesn't that mean God must have a cause too? And if something or someone created God, then what created that? And so on, into an infinite chain of creators. It's a question designed to make believers doubt, to make Christianity seem illogical, and to paint faith as nothing more than a blind leap into the unknown. Maybe you've heard it before. Maybe a friend, a professor, or even a famous scientist has asked it in a way that made you stop and wonder. Maybe you've even asked it yourself, deep in your heart, in those moments when doubt creeps in. If everything has a cause, then doesn't God need one too? It's a fair question. It's a deep question. And it's one that deserves a real answer. But here's the truth, this question is built on a false assumption. It assumes that God is just another thing in the universe, bound by the same rules that govern everything else. It assumes that God had a beginning, just like the stars, the planets, and even human beings. But the Bible tells us something radically different. The Bible tells us that God is not like anything else in creation because He is not part of creation. He is the Creator. Before the mountains were born or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. Psalm 90 verse 2. I am who I am. Exodus 3 verse 14. These are not just poetic phrases. These verses reveal something foundational about God's nature. He was never created. He has always existed. Unlike everything else in the universe, God does not need a cause because He is the ultimate cause of all things. He is outside of time, space, and matter. He is not bound by the rules that apply to us. He is self-existent, meaning He exists by His own nature, not because something else caused Him to exist. This is a concept that can be hard for us to grasp because everything we see, touch, and experience has a beginning. Everything we know operates within time. Things are born, they grow, they age, and eventually, they die. We live in a world where every effect has a cause. But God is not an effect. He is the first, uncaused cause, the one who set everything else into motion. And that's what skeptics don't want to acknowledge. Because if God is the eternal, uncreated creator, then He has authority over all things. He is not just a distant idea or a religious concept, He is real, He is sovereign, and He has a claim on our lives. So in this video, we're going to break it all down. We're going to look at what the Bible says, what logic and philosophy reveal, and even what modern science suggests about the nature of God's existence. We're going to expose the flawed reasoning behind the question, who created God, and show why this question doesn't disprove God, in fact, it points directly to Him. By the end of this video, you will not only have a clear answer to give when someone challenges your faith, but you will also have a deeper confidence in the God you serve. Because understanding God's eternal nature isn't just about winning debates, it's about knowing who He is, trusting in His sovereignty, and standing firm in a world that constantly tries to shake our faith. So let's dive in. Session 1: Understanding the Nature of God. If we're going to answer the question, who created God, we first need to ask a deeper question, who is God? Because before we can even begin to respond to skeptics, we have to understand what the Bible says about God's nature. Most people, even Christians, tend to think about God in human terms. We imagine Him as a powerful being, maybe like a wise old man in the sky, watching over creation. We compare Him to things we know, kings, fathers, rulers, because that's how our minds work. But the problem is, God is not like us. He is not just another being inside the universe. He is outside of it, beyond it, above it. The Bible tells us that God is eternal. That means He has no beginning and no end. Unlike everything else in the universe, stars, planets, animals, people, God has always existed. He did not come into existence. He was not born. He was not created. He simply is. That's exactly what He told Moses in Exodus 3 verse 14, when Moses asked for his name. "I am who I am," God said. "Tell them I am has sent you." Think about that for a moment. God didn't say, "I was created by something greater." He didn't say, "I came into existence at some point in time." He simply said, "I am." That means He has always been. Psalm 90 verse 2 confirms this truth. "Before the mountains were born or you brought forth the whole world, from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." The phrase, "from everlasting to everlasting," means God existed before time began, and He will exist forever. He is the only uncreated being, everything else comes from Him. Now, why is this important? Because the question, "Who created God?" assumes that God is just another thing within the universe, bound by the same rules as everything else. But that's not the case. God is not part of creation, He is the Creator. He exists outside of time, outside of space, outside of everything we can measure. This is hard for us to grasp because we live inside of time. Everything we know has a beginning and an end. We see things start and stop, and we assume that everything must work that way. But time itself is part of creation. And if God created time, then He is not bound by it. He doesn't have a beginning because beginnings only exist inside of time, and God is outside of it. Let me put it another way. Imagine you are an author writing a book. The characters inside your book experience time. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. But you, as the author, are outside of the book. You are not limited by the time inside the story. You exist before the story began, and you continue to exist after it ends. That's how God relates to time. He is outside of it, beyond it, not constrained by it. So when someone asks, "Who created God?" they're misunderstanding who God is. They're treating Him like a created being, when in reality, He is the one who created all things. Isaiah 40 verse 28 says, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the Creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and His understanding no one can fathom." God is everlasting. He is the Creator, not the created. And if we try to put Him inside the limits of time and space, we are making Him smaller than He really is. This truth is foundational. Because if we don't understand who God is, we will never be able to answer questions about His existence. But when we realize that God is outside of time, outside of creation, and beyond human limitations, then the question, "Who created God?" stops making sense. Now, let's take this a step further. Because not only does the Bible tell us that God is eternal, logic and reason also confirm it. And that's what we're going to break down next. Session 2, the flawed logic behind who created God. Now that we understand who God is, we can see why the question, "Who created God?" is based on a false assumption. It's like asking, "What sound does silence make?" or "What does the color blue taste like?" The question itself doesn't make sense because it's built on the wrong premise. Here's why. The question assumes that everything must have a cause. That if something exists, something else must have caused it to exist. And at first glance, that seems reasonable. After all, we live in a world where everything has a cause. A tree comes from a seed. A baby comes from parents. A building comes from an architect. So isn't it logical to think that God must also have a cause? Not exactly. Because there's one major problem with this thinking: only things that begin to exist need a cause. Let me repeat that: only things that begin to exist need a cause. If something had a beginning, then yes, something must have caused it to come into existence. But if something has always existed, it doesn't need a cause. It simply exists by its own nature. This is the key difference between God and everything else. The universe had a beginning. Time, space, and matter had a beginning. Science tells us this. Logic tells us this. Everything we observe tells us that the universe is not eternal, it had a starting point. And because it had a beginning, it needed a cause. But God never had a beginning. He has always existed. And because He is eternal, He doesn't need a cause. He simply is. This is where we introduce the law of causality, one of the most basic principles of logic. The law of causality states that everything that begins to exist must have a cause. But notice something important: this law only applies to things that begin to exist. If something is eternal, if it never had a starting point, then it doesn't need a cause. Let's go even deeper. You may have heard of the Kalam cosmological argument, a famous argument for God's existence. It goes like this: 1. Everything that begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. This argument is widely accepted in both philosophy and science. Even atheists admit that the universe had a beginning. That means something must have caused it. And that cause cannot be part of the universe itself, it must be something outside of time, space, and matter. That's where God comes in. God is the uncaused cause. The first mover. The necessary being that brought everything else into existence. Without Him, nothing could exist. So when an atheist asks, who created God, they're making a category mistake. They're treating God as if He were part of creation when, in reality, He is the Creator. They're assuming He had a beginning, when in fact, He is eternal. This is why the question is flawed from the start. The real question isn't, who created God, but rather, why does anything exist at all? And the answer is simple: because there is a necessary, uncaused Creator who brought everything into being. Now, if this is true, then science should support it too, right? Well, guess what? It does. And in the next session, we're going to look at how even modern science points to the existence of an eternal Creator. Stay with me. This gets even better. Session 3: Science, Creation, and God's Eternal Nature. If God has always existed, and everything in the universe had a beginning, then science should support this, right? Well, here's the amazing part: it does. A lot of people think that faith and science are enemies, as if believing in God means rejecting scientific facts. But that's not true at all. In fact, modern science confirms what the Bible has been saying all along, that the universe had a beginning, that it was designed with precision, and that something outside of time, space, and matter must have brought it into existence. Let's start with the biggest scientific discovery of the last century: the universe had a beginning. For a long time, many scientists believed that the universe was eternal, that it had always existed. That was their way of avoiding the question of God. If the universe had no beginning, then it didn't need a creator. But then came the Big Bang Theory. Now, don't let the name fool you. The Big Bang doesn't disprove God. In fact, it points directly to him. Because what the Big Bang actually shows is that the universe had a definite starting point. Time, space, and matter all began to exist at a single moment. Before that, there was nothing. Let that sink in. Before the universe existed, there was nothing. No time. No space. No matter. Then suddenly, everything appeared out of nowhere. That raises the obvious question, what caused it? This is where many atheists run into trouble. Some try to say, well, maybe the universe just created itself. But that's impossible. Nothing cannot create something. If there was truly nothing before the universe existed, then the universe could not have brought itself into existence. Something outside of time, space, and matter must have caused it to exist. And that's exactly what the Bible has been saying for thousands of years. Genesis 1 verse 1 declares, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." That's not just poetry. It's a direct statement that God is the uncaused cause. He existed before time, before space, before matter. And he is the one who spoke everything into existence. Even famous scientists who are not Christians have admitted that the universe must have been created by something beyond the natural world. Stephen Hawking, an atheist physicist, once wrote, "Almost everyone now believes that the universe, and time itself, had a beginning. And if the universe had a beginning, then it must have had a cause. That cause must be timeless, spaceless, and immaterial, something that exists beyond the physical world." So let's put this all together. 1. The universe had a beginning. 2. Everything that begins to exist must have a cause. 3. That cause must be outside of time, space, and matter. 4. The Bible tells us that God is eternal and created all things. This is why science actually supports belief in God rather than contradicting it. And yet, many atheists still refuse to accept this. They try to come up with alternative explanations to avoid acknowledging a creator. That brings us to the next big question: why do atheists resist this truth so much? Let's dig into that next. Session 4: What atheists get wrong about God. If the evidence is so clear, then why do atheists still ask, who created God? Why do they refuse to accept the idea of an eternal creator, even when science, philosophy, and logic all point to it? The answer is simple: because admitting that God exists means admitting that he has authority. And that's something many people don't want to do. Romans 1 verses 19 to 20 tells us, "For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived, ever since the creation of the world, in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse." In other words, deep down, people know that God exists. His fingerprints are all over creation. The complexity of the universe, the fine-tuning of life, the moral laws we all follow, these things all point to a creator. But many people suppress that truth because they don't want to be accountable to God. Take Richard Dawkins, for example. He's one of the most famous atheists in the world. In his book The God Delusion, he argues that if everything needs a cause, then God must need a cause too. But as we've already seen, that's a complete misunderstanding of how cause and effect work. Dawkins assumes that God is part of the created universe, rather than the creator. He applies the rules of time and space to God, ignoring the fact that God exists outside of time and space. It's like asking, who painted the painter? or what caused the uncaused cause? The question itself makes no sense. And this isn't just Dawkins. Many atheists make the same mistake. They say things like, well, maybe the universe just always existed. But science shows it had a beginning. Maybe there's a multiverse. But that just pushes the problem back. Who created the multiverse? We just don't know. But refusing to accept the truth doesn't make it go away. Atheists try so hard to avoid God, not because the evidence is weak, but because they don't want to submit to Him. They don't want a God who has authority over their lives. Because if God is real, then that means we are not in control. He is. That's why Romans 1 says that people suppress the truth in unrighteousness. It's not that they don't have enough evidence. It's that they don't want to accept the evidence. But here's the good news: the truth is still the truth, whether people accept it or not. God exists. He is eternal. He is the Creator. And one day, every person will stand before Him. This is why answering the question, who created God, isn't just about winning a debate. It's about helping people see the truth so they can come to know the God who made them. It's about removing obstacles so that people can encounter Jesus. And that brings us to the most important part of this entire discussion, the biblical answer that atheists don't want to hear. Because the Bible doesn't just tell us that God is eternal, it tells us why that matters. Let's explore that next. Session 5, the biblical answer atheists don't want you to hear. So far, we've established that God is eternal, that He is the uncaused cause, and that science and logic confirm what the Bible has been saying all along. We've also seen how atheists often reject this truth, not because of a lack of evidence, but because accepting it would mean acknowledging that God has authority over their lives. But now, we arrive at the heart of this entire discussion, the biblical answer that atheists don't want to hear. Because the question, who created God, is not just about philosophy or science. It's about who God is and what that means for us. In John 1 verses 1 to 3, we find one of the most profound declarations in all of Scripture. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. This passage is referring to Jesus. It tells us that Jesus Himself is eternal, that He was with God from the very beginning, and that all things were created through Him. This is the answer that changes everything. Because not only is God eternal, but He stepped into time and space in the form of Jesus Christ. This is where Christianity stands apart from every other worldview. It's not just about a distant, all-powerful Creator who exists beyond time. It's about a God who entered into His own creation to reveal Himself to us. This is what atheists don't want to hear, that the eternal God is not just some abstract force, but a personal, loving, relational being who desires to know us. The moment they acknowledge this, everything changes. Colossians 1 verses 16 to 17 says, "For by Him all things were created, in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or dominions or rulers or authorities, all things were created through Him and for Him. And He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together." This means that God is not just the creator of the universe, He is also the sustainer of all things. He didn't just set the universe in motion and walk away. He is actively holding everything together. Every breath we take, every beat of our hearts, every star that shines in the night sky, all of it exists because of Him. And here's the part that many people struggle to accept: if God is eternal, if He created all things, if He holds the universe together, then we are accountable to Him. He is not just a distant idea or a philosophical concept. He is the living God, and one day, every person will stand before him. This is why many people reject him, not because the evidence isn't there, but because they don't want a God who has authority over them. They want to live life on their own terms. They don't want to admit that their choices, their actions, and their beliefs have eternal consequences. But whether people accept it or not, the truth remains: God is real. God is eternal. And God has revealed himself through Jesus Christ. Now, the question is, what do we do with this truth? And that leads us to our final session. Session 6, Strengthening Your Faith, How This Truth Changes Everything. Understanding God's eternal nature isn't just about winning debates or proving atheists wrong. It's about building a faith that is unshakable. Because when you truly grasp that God is eternal, it changes everything. First, it gives us confidence in our faith. If God is the uncaused cause, if he is the source of all things, then we can trust him completely. We don't have to be afraid of new scientific discoveries, philosophical arguments, or skeptical challenges. The truth is on our side. Isaiah 46 verses 9 to 10 says, "I am God, and there is no other, I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose." This means that nothing surprises God. No argument against him can stand. No attack on Christianity will succeed. Because he is sovereign, and his truth will always prevail. Second, it strengthens us in times of doubt. There may be moments when our faith is tested, when we struggle with questions, when we wonder if we truly understand who God is. But when we come back to the truth that he is eternal, unchanging, and all-powerful, we find peace. Malachi 3 verse 6 says, "For I the Lord do not change, therefore you, O children of Jacob, are not consumed." God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. No matter what happens in the world, no matter how much culture shifts, no matter how many people try to argue against him, he remains. And that means our faith remains strong in him. Third, it calls us to share the truth with others. Because if God is eternal, if he is the creator of all things, then every person needs to know him. This truth isn't just for us, it's for the world. 1 Peter 3 verse 15 tells us, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you, yet do it with gentleness and respect." We are called to defend our faith, not with arrogance, not with anger, but with gentleness and respect. Because at the end of the day, our goal is not just to win arguments. It's to lead people to the eternal God who loves them. So let me ask you, are you ready to stand firm in your faith? Are you ready to confidently answer when someone asks, "Who created God?" Are you prepared to share the truth with those who are searching? Because the world needs to hear this message. And it starts with us. Conclusion, the truth that sets us free. Let's bring it all together. We started with a simple question: who created God? A question that skeptics and atheists love to use as if it's an argument against Christianity. But as we've seen, this question is based on a false assumption. God was not created. He is eternal. He is the uncaused cause. He exists outside of time, space, and matter. Science, philosophy, and logic all confirm what the Bible has been saying for thousands of years. And more than that, God is not just a distant creator. He is personal, loving, and relational. He revealed himself to us through Jesus Christ. He holds all things together. And one day, we will stand before Him. So the next time someone asks you, who created God? You'll know exactly how to respond. You'll be able to stand firm in your faith. You'll be able to explain the truth with confidence. And most importantly, you'll be able to share the message of the eternal God who loves us. This is not just an argument to win. This is a truth that sets us free. Now, it's up to you. Will you hold on to this truth? Will you share it with others? Will you stand firm in the God who has always been and will always be? Because He is the beginning and the end, the Alpha and the Omega. He was, and is to come. And that is the truth that will never change.